Hello there, my art friends. Here you may recognize this piece of paper from the video I did the other day on how to dip or brush in ink. Today I want to go to another basic lesson on how to use a brush. And there's actually more than just my way to use a brush. Which is, more than my way too. A bunch of people use a brush this way. Where I'm basically a methodical artist, which means that method is very important to me. Whatever method I use, I stick to and build up something. Out of that, it's that method that helps me get to the end result I want. Now, there's other artists I have friends who are, rather than being methodical artists, they're more spontaneous artists. And method isn't nearly so important to them. That's not how they get their end result. And some of these people I know would use a brush differently than me. Their use of a brush would be more spontaneous. And I have one particular friend who's very good at what I call mark making. Meaning that if you give him this brush, see how all these marks are the same here that I made? That's what I automatically do. I'm automatically forever searching for the same perfect line and for constructing my drawing out of that same perfect line as much as I can. Like I said, but other people who are more spontaneous aren't searching for that perfect line. They're looking to make marks in an interesting way. And like I said, my friend who's a very good mark maker would take this same brush, and if he were to just start doodling on this paper, you'd see 10 different marks rather than the same one on my papers. That's just one difference in how different people use a brush. But basically, here we go. I'm trying to make a line from thick to thin. So start with little pressure and make the pressure more as you keep going so the line gets thicker. And you can do this on a large scale or a small scale. But that's basically what it is. It's adding more pressure to the brush as you go along. That's also sort of the European way of using a brush, in that you're using kind of the tip and the side of the brush to go from thick to thin on the long way. The Japanese, Chinese calligraphy way of holding the brush is you hold it straight up and down and you make marks that way, which I'm not as good at. If you ever see a Chinese or Japanese calligraphy master, the brush, they can really make the brush dance in their hand and do things that I don't usually do with a brush. I'm mostly a European brush style guy, but sometimes you have to employ both ways of doing things, especially if you're for some reason, I'm forever making spirals. I love spirals. So when I'm making a spiral, I'm usually doing that in the more Japanese method, because it just is easier holding the brush straight up and down and making a spiral. And then I'll often come in and clean up the edges a little bit in my search for the perfect mark. But once again, this is one of the larger brushes, and if I really point it, that is what you do your hatching and cross hatching with. This is sort of a Brian Boland type hatching line that he always does, where he gets the positive. I don't quite have it because they all have to match up at the end here, like these ones, where you have it blend into a perfect black. Whoops, see that I have to. If I was real good at this particular method, I wouldn't have to make these lines twice as I do. Just going thick to thin, like I said, that's the that's the Brian Boland style hatching that he does. He does it on the computer now. Doesn't even use a brush, but that's what he always did for years. That's just hatching. And then there's cross hatching, which of course just means, once again, hatching and cross hatching lines are usually short. There's some hatching. And there's, whoops, didn't point that enough. There's some cross hatching. So there's basically the hatching and cross hatching. Then it's interesting, I think it was Keith Williams. The whole image style in the late 80s, early 90s, and Marvel and Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, if you look at their work, you'll see they actually, and I think Keith Williams, the inker, I heard started this. I don't know how true that is, but you can see it in all their work. They started the hatching, I don't know what you'd call it, triple hatching, but you'd have hatching and then cross hatching going in this direction. Then they put a third hatch coming in this direction. So you'd get a pattern like that. So if you look up that late 80s, early 90s image style, you'll see that triple hatching, I guess. I've never even heard it given a name. Kind of became the norm in comics for a while. That's the instead of, before, if you look at like Neil Adams, something like that, that was all about hatching and cross. Brian Boland is all about hatching. Neil Adams was all about cross hatching. And then, Keith Williams, I think, like I said, I think it was him. I'm giving credit for it because I heard someone else do that. Came up with this sort of triple hatching. And those are just some of the basic marks. Then there's a lot more you can do with a brush. But you'll see one of the things I've seen people try to do, which is tricky, is instead of going from thin to thick, they try to go from thick to thin, which is a much tougher thing to do. Press down and then pull off. It's tough to get a good clean hatch mark that way. But I've seen people try to do it. You end up with a sort of dry brush mark at the end. And this is why some people like, this is a number 3 brush. This is why some people like the number 2 brush, because they can get all these marks a little bit smaller. And then there's also, I often use textures and patterns too that other people don't. And I like the side of the brush. You'll see a lot of people use this when they're inking. You can watch inking videos and see guys using the side of the brush to kind of get this uneven textured line. You can do, like, I think Al Williamson, did he use this with John Romita? I think John Romita Jr. had some guys. Like I said, you can use a marker. I've seen you use marker and pen for this, but like I said, I'm a brush person. But there's your basic side of the brush. Same thing, except you're not going thick to thin. You're just using the side of the brush to get this sort of interesting mark. But I also do things like with the brush, like using instead of going across with an even pressure, I'll vary my pressure going across. And I'll use this in areas where I want sort of a pattern, where I want a texture. Like I said, this is just kind of a specialized mark. That when I want, anything where I want not a solid black, but some sort of interesting texture. we can get that. But also remember, when you're making, if you look at these lines right here, you can see how curved they are. That's the curve of my arm. When I'm making these lines too, you can't see it. You don't necessarily want to plant your hand on the table and then just move your wrist. You want to move. I'm moving my whole arm as I'm making it. It's the sweep of my arm. Sort of my the meat of my forearm near my elbow is on the table, and I'm using that as a pivot point to make that whole motion. Rather than some people, the mistake they make is they use their wrist as a pivot point. And that's okay for little tiny lines, but if you're trying to make a large line with your wrist as a pivot point, you get stuck because your wrist doesn't move that way. So you have to be able to sweep with your whole arm in order to get these. And you always want to work whatever line you're at, you want to work the angle coming towards you. So if there's a line, if there's an arm line that goes, I don't want to be trying to make the mark like that. That's too hard. Instead, I want to sweep the paper around and make the mark like that. So you always want to follow your arm too as you go through it. That's why you'll see inkers working, or even pencilers, they're constantly moving the paper around to get that perfect angle for whatever they're trying to do. Like I said, if I were going to the curve of a face, I'd hold it more Japanese and go around like that and snap it up. That way I can get a curve like that going. Yeah, doing that with your hand flat like that is a little more difficult. So, like I said, I'm mostly the European way, but you got to work some of the Chinese and Japanese way in there too. So there you go. That's just a little lesson in making marks with a brush.